What if I told you there is one hidden truth, so simple yet so devastating, that when men finally recognize it, the entire game changes forever? Imagine a shift so profound it dismantles illusions, strips away manipulation, and leaves no room for pretense. This isn't about bitterness or revenge. It's about clarity, power, and freedom. Because when men awaken to what has always been right in front of them, the strategies, the games, the tests all collapse instantly. And in that moment, everything that once gave women their quiet advantage dissolves. The illusion of power begins to fade. For generations, the dynamic between men and women has rested on something subtle, something unseen. Not brute strength or financial control, but psychological influence, a kind of invisible gravity that shapes how attraction, affection, and desire are exchanged. Women, whether consciously or not, have learned how to navigate this space with precision, how to project vulnerability when it draws in attention, how to amplify charm when it secures affection, how to withhold warmth when it restores control. The game has never been about what's real, but about what's promised. Men are often captured not by truth, but by potential, by the illusion of connection, the performance of affection, the suggestion of exclusivity. And because the illusion feels real, they chase it. But when a man begins to see through it, when he finally understands that the magic he thought was unique has been offered countless times before, the spell breaks. Suddenly, what once seemed sacred becomes a pattern. What once felt special becomes routine, and the mystique that once had power vanishes. This realization doesn't lead to anger. It leads to clarity. It allows a man to ask himself, why have I been measuring my worth through someone else's approval? Why have I been chasing validation instead of owning my own strength? That moment is seismic because once he sees behind the curtain, he can never unsee it. When this awakening happens, something shifts deep inside. The chase ends, the need to impress fades, the endless proving stops. A man who no longer seeks validation becomes dangerous, not because he's cruel, but because he's free. He no longer plays by the old rules, and that freedom rewrites the entire dynamic. The woman who once relied on his attention to feel powerful now finds herself unsure, unsettled, even drawn to him more deeply. Because the paradox of power is this: when a man no longer needs approval, he becomes infinitely more magnetic. But to understand how this illusion of power survives, you must see the deeper layer beneath it: emotional manipulation. It's not always loud or obvious. Often it's quiet, a sigh at the right time, a withdrawal of warmth, a sudden silence. These things don't just sting, they create uncertainty. They make a man question himself: what did I do wrong? How do I fix it? How do I win her back? And in that self doubt, control takes root. Men are conditioned from an early age to fix things, to take responsibility for every emotional imbalance in a relationship. So when affection is withheld, they assume they failed. And that belief is where the manipulation thrives. But here's the moment everything changes: when a man recognizes emotional games for what they are, tactics, not truth, he reclaims his power. When she goes silent and he can calmly think, this isn't mine to fix, he steps into strength. The guilt fades, the panic quiets, the manipulation loses its grip. Suddenly, he can care deeply without being controlled. He can be compassionate without being compliant, because emotions, as powerful as they are not commands. And when a man learns to separate the two, he becomes unshakable. This kind of clarity transforms everything. It doesn't make him cold or detached, it makes him centered. When a man listens without losing his ground, when he can stay kind but firm, he becomes the rarest kind of partner. The relationship either matures or it collapses, but either way, he wins. because if it matures, it does so on equal footing. And if it collapses, it's because the manipulation can no longer survive. The truth is that in today's world, the most powerful currency isn't love, money, or even sex, it's attention. Attention is what drives desire, validation, and power. Every glance, message, or text is a deposit into someone's sense of worth. And women, whether consciously or instinctively, know this. Attention feeds their self-image. It fuels the sense of being desired. But here's where men often make their biggest mistake. They give their attention away too easily. They offer it freely, constantly, desperately. And every time they do, its value diminishes. A man who gives his attention without purpose becomes predictable, replaceable, powerless. But a man who controls it, who learns that his attention is a limited resource, changes the game entirely. He realizes that his focus, his words, his energy all carry weight. So he directs them carefully. He doesn't chase, he chooses. And when he becomes selective, his attention becomes rare, and rarity creates power. Suddenly, the same woman who once ignored him is drawn in. The same games that once worked now fail because they no longer earn his focus. This isn't about indifference, it's about discipline. A man who values his attention becomes a man whose presence commands respect. He doesn't rush to fill silence. He doesn't beg for responses. He stands still, calm, certain. And that composure radiates strength. It is magnetic. When men learn to guard their attention, they reclaim their power, and the illusion that once kept them trapped evaporates. But attention alone isn't enough. It's what that attention protects. Independence. Independence is the fortress every man must build, because the greatest weakness any man can have is believing his value depends on someone else's approval. The moment he believes he needs her to feel whole, he's given her the keys to his freedom. And the tragic irony is that the more dependent a man becomes, the less desirable he appears. Neediness doesn't inspire affection, it drains it. Now imagine the opposite. A man who stands firm in his own identity, who loves without losing himself, who can be alone without feeling empty. That man cannot be manipulated. He cannot be guilted into submission. His peace does not depend on her moods. His joy does not collapse when she pulls away. He remains grounded, steady, whole. And this independence doesn't make him cold. It makes him powerful, because love, when given freely instead of fearfully, becomes deeper, more honest, more real. The man who knows he is enough on his own becomes irresistible, not because he plays games, but because he doesn't need to. His independence radiates confidence. It says, I choose you, but I don't need you to complete me. And that energy draws people in. It's the difference between chasing and attracting. And once enough men embody this independence, the entire structure of manipulation collapses. Then comes the deeper truth, desire itself. For centuries, the unspoken rule has been that men must chase while women choose. That intimacy is something men earn through effort, patience, or sacrifice. But this idea is false. Desire is not owed, it's negotiated, it's mutual, or it's meaningless. The moment a man realizes that intimacy is not a reward, but a shared expression, everything changes. He stops chasing what's withheld. He stops accepting rejection as proof of inadequacy. He stops trading self-respect for temporary closeness. He understands that true connection cannot be forced, bought, or manipulated. It must be mutual. And when he sees this, the leverage disappears. The withholding no longer controls him. The promise of intimacy no longer dictates his choices. He knows he has the power to walk away, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. And that is where freedom begins, because when desire becomes a choice, not a prize, relationships become equal again. Men no longer play roles written by someone else. They no longer operate under the illusion that love must be earned through self-sacrifice. Instead, they realize that love only thrives where respect flows both ways, and that understanding is unstoppable. Finally, there is the man who embodies all of this, the unshakable man, the one who cannot be easily moved, who cannot be manipulated through silence or seduction, who doesn't crumble under pressure. He listens, but he doesn't lose himself. He feels, but he doesn't fall apart. His calmness is not coldness, it's mastery. He has control over himself, and that control radiates confidence. Women are drawn to this kind of man not because he's indifferent, but because he's centered. His strength is quiet. His boundaries are clear. His energy is steady. He doesn't need to prove his worth because he already knows it. And that steadiness makes him irresistible. Because in a world of men who bend too easily, the one who stands firm becomes unforgettable. When men collectively step into this kind of strength, grounded, disciplined, independent, the old games die, the manipulation fails, the illusion of control collapses, because no one can control a man who knows who he is. No one can shame him, guilt him, or entice him into surrendering his peace. And when that happens, the balance finally resets. This awakening isn't about anger. It's not about tearing anyone down. It's about reclaiming what was always yours: dignity, self, respect, and choice. The man who understands these truths walks through the world with quiet power. He doesn't chase illusions. He doesn't need permission to be whole. He loves fully but freely. And that kind of man, the man who is awake, centered, unshakable, cannot be finished. Because once men awaken to their own worth, everything changes forever. What if I told you that there's a truth so simple, so hidden in plain sight, that once a man truly sees it, nothing about his relationships, his choices, or his inner world will ever look the same again? It isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself with lightning and thunder. It arrives quietly like a slow sunrise after years of darkness. But when it does, it changes everything. Because in that moment, all the illusions begin to fade. The illusions of control, of validation, of needing to be chosen to feel worthy. The truth is this: the moment a man stops trying to prove himself for love, he begins to remember who he really is. For most of his life, he has been told that love is something he must earn. That affection is conditional. That approval must be deserved. From childhood, the message is whispered in 1,000 little ways. Be good, be nice, be needed, be useful. The moment he tries to assert himself, he is told to calm down. The moment he expresses pain, he's told to toughen up. Somewhere in the middle of all that conditioning, he forgets that his worth existed before anyone's opinion of him. And so he grows into a man who seeks reflection instead of reality. He begins to define himself by how others respond to him, especially by how women do. He begins to chase validation in the form of affection, attention, and approval. Every glance, every reply, every moment of warmth feels like oxygen. Every withdrawal, every silence feels like drowning. Without realizing it, he hands over his power piece by piece, not because he is weak, but because he has been taught that to love is to surrender, to chase, to prove. But one day something shifts. Maybe it's not even dramatic. Maybe it's a quiet realization during a late night drive, or a moment of stillness after another argument that leaves him empty. Maybe it's the exhaustion of constantly trying to be enough for someone who never asked him to stop running. Whatever it is, there's a moment where he looks at himself and asks why. Why am I chasing something that keeps running? Why am I giving so much energy to being chosen instead of choosing myself? That question is where the awakening begins. Because when a man finally sees the patterns, the way he gives attention without awareness, the way he confuses affection with validation, the way he sacrifices peace for approval, he doesn't become bitter. He becomes aware. He starts noticing the small manipulations that once went unnoticed, not maliciously intended, just instinctively used. A sigh, a silence, a withdrawal, a test. He sees how often emotion has been weaponized in subtle ways. He sees how he has been trained to react, to fix, to chase comfort instead of holding boundaries. And suddenly he stops reacting. Not because he doesn't care, but because he finally does for himself. He stops chasing peace in the places that disturb it. He stops trying to earn what should be freely given. That's when the balance begins to shift. It's almost mystical, that shift. He doesn't need to speak it out loud. He doesn't announce it, but something changes in the way he moves, the way he looks, the way he carries himself. His attention, once scattered and desperate, becomes focused, intentional. His silence stops being a sign of weakness and starts becoming a source of strength. He learns that attention is not infinite, it's currency. And where he places it determines who holds the power. He begins to understand that not everyone deserves his energy, that not every message deserves a reply, not every conflict deserves a response, not every cold silence deserves to be warmed. He stops being predictable. He learns to pause before reacting. He learns to breathe before chasing. He learns to protect his focus as if it were gold, because it is. And something remarkable happens when he does. The dynamic flips. Those who were once indifferent begin to take notice. The same people who once controlled him with inconsistency begin to lean in, sensing something different. A calmness, a self-possession, a refusal to be controlled. He doesn't play games, yet somehow he can no longer be played. His presence becomes magnetic not because he's trying to be, but because he finally has boundaries. He starts to see love not as a battlefield, but as an exchange, a place where mutual respect replaces hidden expectations. He no longer confuses attention with affection, validation with connection, or desire with worth. He starts to give differently, slower, deeper, more intentionally, and when he does, the world around him rearranges itself. For the first time, he experiences what real independence feels like. Independence is not loneliness. It's not coldness. It's the quiet knowing that his happiness is his responsibility alone. He can share it, but he no longer trades it. He can give love, but he doesn't need to lose himself to do it. He realizes that peace is not found in being needed, it's found in being whole. Independence makes him magnetic, not because it creates distance, but because it creates depth. People feel it. They sense that he cannot be owned, that he is not trying to be saved or seen or chosen. He simply is rooted, steady, unshakable. And that's when something beautiful happens, real connection emerges. The illusions fall away, the masks come off, the performance of attraction, the unspoken games, the emotional tactics, all of it loses its meaning in front of authenticity. He begins to attract those who no longer need to control because they too are at peace within themselves. But the truth is, not every connection will survive his awakening. Some will crumble. The ones built on dependence, on control, on unspoken hierarchies, they will dissolve, sometimes painfully. And yet, in that loss, he finds freedom because he understands now that what ends is not love, it's illusion. Real love, the kind that doesn't demand self-erasure, only grows stronger in the presence of truth. When a man becomes grounded, when his peace no longer depends on someone else's approval, something profound takes place. The emotional manipulation that once worked begins to fail. The same silence that used to cut him down now only deepens his calm. The tears that once dictated his behavior now meet compassion, not compliance. He can hold empathy and boundaries at the same time. That's real strength. He no longer sees love as a transaction. He no longer negotiates his self-respect for affection. He no longer measures his worth in how much he can give before being appreciated. Instead, he learns to walk away when respect disappears, not out of pride, but out of self-trust, because the man who knows he can walk away is the man who no longer fears losing himself. This kind of man doesn't hate, he doesn't judge, he doesn't retaliate. He simply doesn't engage in anything that costs him his peace. He lives differently. He speaks less, listens more, moves slower, and chooses deliberately. His life begins to mirror his clarity. The chaos that used to surround him fades because he no longer feeds it. You can see it in his eyes. There's a steadiness there now, a quiet that unsettles those who still chase chaos and comforts those who seek truth. He's not performing. He's not trying to prove he's strong. His strength is effortless because it's real. It's the strength that comes from knowing that love is only worth having when it's free from fear. There's something magnetic about that kind of presence. It draws people in, not because he's mysterious, but because he's rare. In a world that rewards reaction, he chooses reflection. In a culture obsessed with attention, he values intention. In relationships filled with control, he brings surrender, not the weak kind, but the powerful kind that says, I am here because I choose to be, not because I need to be. When you watch a man like this, you realize he's not at war with the world anymore. He's simply done fighting battles that were never his to win. He no longer seeks validation from the outside because he's found it within. And that kind of peace can't be faked. But it's not just about relationships. His awakening ripples through every part of his life. He starts showing up differently in his work, in his friendships, in his silence. He doesn't chase attention from others because he's finally giving attention to himself, to his growth, his purpose, his craft. He stops apologizing for his ambitions, his boundaries, his standards. He begins to see that masculinity isn't about dominance or control. It's about stability, depth, and direction. The man who used to be lost in pursuit now becomes a beacon. He doesn't need to convince anyone of his worth. He simply lives it. He no longer over-explains himself or seeks understanding from those committed to misunderstanding him. He no longer argues for his value. He knows that those who can't see it aren't meant to. He becomes unshakable, not because life stops testing him, but because he stops reacting to every test. He learns that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the mastery of response. He can love without losing himself, forgive without forgetting his worth, give without emptying his soul. And that's the ultimate power, the power to remain kind in a world that confuses kindness for weakness, the power to remain open in a world that rewards armor, the power to remain present in a world addicted to distraction. When a man reaches this place, the world starts to see him differently. Not because he's doing more, but because he's being more. Every word he speaks carries weight because it's born of calm, not chaos. Every move he makes carries intention because it's grounded in purpose, not approval. This is what freedom looks like, not rebellion, not detachment, but self-mastery, the freedom to love without fear, to give without expectation, to walk away without anger. It's not about control over others. It's about control over oneself. He no longer plays the old game because he's outgrown it. He doesn't need to win arguments or prove dominance. He's too focused on alignment with truth, with peace, with purpose. He's learned that what's meant for him will never require him to abandon who he is. And that's the quiet revolution, not against women, not against love, but against illusion. The illusion that worth must be earned. The illusion that validation equals connection. The illusion that peace can be found in another person's approval. When a man wakes up from those illusions, he steps into a world that operates by different laws. He no longer fears being alone because he's finally met himself. He no longer confuses silence for rejection, distance for disinterest, or disagreement for disrespect. He's no longer afraid to say no, no longer desperate to hear yes. And in that stillness, in that calm defiance against the noise of the world, he becomes magnetic in ways that words can't describe. Because true power doesn't shout, it doesn't threaten, it doesn't demand. It simply stands there, unbothered, unwavering, undeniable. He becomes a man of peace, a man of presence, a man who no longer seeks to be understood by everyone because he finally understands himself. And that is the real awakening, because once a man truly awakens, once he learns that love is not a test, that peace is not earned, and that validation is not the same as connection, he can never go back to sleep. He moves differently, loves differently, lives differently, not because he's become colder, but because he's finally become whole. And when that happens, when men collectively begin to live from this grounded awareness, the world itself begins to change. Not because one gender loses power, but because balance finally returns. The game ends, the masks fall, and what remains is truth, simple, quiet, and unshakable. Because in the end, awakening isn't about control, it's about freedom. It's about finally realizing that the love you've been chasing was never out there. It was always waiting for you to remember who you are